You ever notice how nobody admits they bought the wrong bike until you see them selling it on Craigslist? People don't regret buying bikes because they're slow. They regret them because they're annoying, hot, heavy, expensive, or just way more work than they expected. Tonight, we're showing 10 motorcycles that look amazing at first and turn into a "it's just not for me" real fast. If you own one of these and you're still defending your purchase in the comments, we'll know you haven't tried selling it yet. Let's get into it. First on the list, Harley-Davidson Pan America 1250. It's got a 1252cc V-twin buried under so many electronics that when something acts weird, you can't just fix it. You're calling the dealer and hoping they can translate what the computer's complaining about. Semi-active suspension adjusts itself, ride height changes on its own, and you can't manually override most of it, which is great when the bike disagrees with your decisions. Sensors everywhere, software managing everything, and the result is that owning this feels less like riding a motorcycle and more like tech support for something with two wheels. Early models had recall after recall, and a lot of owners found themselves back at the dealership more often than they planned, which really builds trust in a $20,000 purchase. The bike rides great when all the systems cooperate, but the second a warning light pops up or something doesn't behave right, that confidence disappears fast because you know you're not fixing this yourself. People wanted Harley's reliability with adventure bike capability, and instead they got a machine that requires dealer diagnostics for problems their old Sportster would have let them handle with a wrench and 10 minutes. Software updates at the dealership become part of your routine, which is perfect because nothing says freedom of the open road like waiting for your motorcycle to install patches. The whole ownership experience ends up being about managing systems and hoping nothing decides to throw a code when you're 300 miles from a dealer with the right laptop. The adaptive features are impressive until they stop working and start costing money. By 2026, the regret kicks in when you realize you bought a Harley that needs an IT guy more than a mechanic, and the whole point of owning a Harley was supposed to be freedom, not scheduling dealer appointments to fix problems you can't even see. Second, KTM 1290 Super Duke R. This is genuinely one of the most exciting bikes you can ride until you remember it's a KTM and start doing math on how far you are from the nearest dealer. 1301cc V-twin making absurd torque, aggressive naked bike setup, and when everything's working, it's absolutely brilliant. The kind of bike that makes you grin inside your helmet. The problem isn't the performance, it's that you can never fully relax and enjoy it because KTM's reputation follows you everywhere and that little voice in your head keeps asking when something's gonna break. You're not managing electronics complexity like the Pan America, you're managing anxiety. Every ride becomes this mental calculation of how far you're going, what the temperature is, whether today's the day a sensor decides to quit or a recall finally catches up to you. The bike doesn't feel like a tool you trust. It feels like a relationship that requires constant emotional management. Owners talk about how incredible it is when it's running right, but also how exhausting it is to never know if you're gonna make it home without drama. Multiple recalls across KTM's big twins didn't help, and neither did the stories from other owners who've spent more time at dealers than they planned. The torque is violent enough that electronics have to intervene constantly just to keep you pointing straight, which is impressive until you realize you're trusting a lot of sensors on a bike from a brand that's not exactly famous for electrical reliability. By 2026, the regret sets in when you realize you bought the most exciting bike you're too stressed to actually enjoy, and that performance you paid for gets overshadowed by the anxiety of wondering if it'll strand you. Coming in third, Kawasaki Ninja H2. You bought the dream, and the dream came with a supercharger, over 300 horsepower if you get the track version, and enough heat output that parking near other bikes feels irresponsible. The supercharged inline-4 makes power that's completely absurd for street use. Advanced electronics trying their best to keep you alive, and a weight that reminds you this isn't a normal sport bike every time you try to move it around. The performance is undeniable, but here's the thing. You're never actually using it because where exactly are you going to explore 300 horsepower on public roads without ending up in jail or worse? What you do get to experience is the heat, especially in traffic where the thing turns into a mobile sauna, and the size and weight that make casual riding feel like work instead of fun. The riding position is committed and aggressive, which is fine for short blasts, but gets uncomfortable quick on anything resembling normal riding. A lot of owners find themselves riding way below what the bike can do, which makes the whole experience feel wasteful, and after a while, that initial excitement fades into, "Why did I buy this?" Maintenance isn't cheap either, and the supercharger adds complexity that regular sport bikes just don't have, which means more expensive service intervals and more things that can potentially go wrong. The H2 and its variants are technological showcases, and they're impressive, but daily reality is managing heat and mass and realizing you bought excess instead of enjoyment. In 2026, regret hits when you're sitting in traffic sweating and thinking about how a normal bike would be so much easier to live with and cost less to maintain. Number 4. Suzuki Hayabusa GSX 1300R. The Hayabusa has this legendary reputation from the early 2000s when it was the fastest thing on two wheels, and people still buy them chasing that legacy, except the bike doesn't really match how anyone actually rides anymore. 1299cc inline 4, long wheelbase, designed for stability at speeds you're definitely not doing, and a wet weight that makes every parking lot maneuver feel like a gym session. Modern versions have ride modes and traction control and all the electronics, but they can't fix the fundamental problem, which is that this bike is built for a use case that barely exists outside of highway pulls and YouTube videos. The size and weight are constant reminders that you're riding something designed for different priorities, and most owners spend their time managing mass instead of enjoying agility. Fuel stops are frequent, low-speed riding is work, and the whole experience ends up being about restraint instead of fun, because you're always aware you're on this big heavy rocket that you're using maybe 10% of. The styling hasn't aged particularly well either, and what looked futuristic in 1999 now looks dated in a way that's hard to ignore. The Hayabusa name still carries weight, but the reality of living with one in 2026 is realizing you bought a piece of history that doesn't fit into your actual riding life, and now you're stuck making excuses for why you keep it instead of just admitting it was a mistake. The performance is still there, but so is the realization that performance you can't use isn't actually worth anything. At number 5, BMW S1000RR. You bought a race bike for the street, and congratulations, you now own a machine that's absolutely miserable everywhere except the one place you're probably not riding it, which is a racetrack. High output inline 4, aggressive geometry, suspension tuned for lap times, and ergonomics designed by someone who apparently hates human spines. The bike is phenomenal when you're pushing it hard on track, but on the street it's just punishment. Heat blasting your legs, riding position that makes your wrists scream, and suspension so stiff that every road imperfection goes straight into your skeleton. A lot of people buy this because race bike and then discover that streets aren't racetracks. And commuting on something built for Mugello is like wearing a tuxedo to mow the lawn. Technically possible, but deeply stupid. The electronics are advanced and the performance is there, but without regular track days, you're just living with a caged animal that's angry. You're not letting it do what it was built for. Recalls exist, dealer dependence is high, and the whole ownership experience requires commitment that most people don't actually have. Wind protection is minimal, so highway riding is exhausting, and the riding position means your neck and shoulders will remind you of your poor decisions on any ride over 30 minutes. The bike looks incredible sitting still, and that's good, because that's where it'll spend a lot of time once you realize how much you don't enjoy actually riding it anywhere normal. In 2026, the regret comes from realizing you bought race capability for street reality, and now every ride is a reminder that you made an expensive mistake based on a fantasy you're not actually living. Number 6. Ducati Panigale V4. The Street Fighter V4 bought the Italian dream, and the dream runs hot enough to cook breakfast on your inner thighs. V4 engine-making race-level power, electronic suite that's impressive until you're stuck in traffic wondering why you need slide control at 15 miles per hour, and styling so good it convinced you that looking amazing was worth melting in stopped traffic. The heat is genuinely brutal, not, oh, it's a little warm, but this is actively unpleasant. And it doesn't care if you're commuting or riding spirited, the bike runs hot and you're gonna know about it. Suspension is firm, throttle response is aggressive. The whole riding experience demands constant attention even when you're just trying to get coffee. And after a while, that intensity stops being thrilling and starts being exhausting. People buy these for the prestige and the performance, but daily reality is managing heat and constantly being on, when sometimes you just want to ride without the bike demanding your full focus. The Street Fighter V4 has the same issues, just without the fairings to trap even more heat against you. Maintenance costs are predictably Italian, which means expensive, and the service intervals come up faster than you'd like. Track days make these bikes sing, but most owners don't do enough track days to justify the compromise, and the ones who do start realizing they could have bought a dedicated track bike for less money and kept something reasonable for the street. By 2026, the regret sets in when you realize you bought a stunning piece of Italian engineering that you actually don't enjoy riding most of the time, because it's just too much bike for regular use and your bank account is suffering for the privilege. Taking 7th spot, Indian FTR 1200. You fell in love with how it looks in photos, and that's great because the looks are pretty much all you're going to be happy about long term. Flat track styling that's genuinely cool, V-twin with decent torque and an upright riding position that feels good for about 45 minutes before you realize the ergonomics weren't designed for actual long rides. The real kicker is the fuel range, which is bad enough that you'll get familiar with every gas station in your area real quick. People buy this for the aesthetic and the Indian badge, and then reality hits when they're planning routes around fuel stops like it's 1975 and trying to convince themselves that character is worth the constant compromise. The bike does short-spirited rides well, but ask it to be your everyday machine, and the limitations become obvious fast. Wind protection is basically non-existent, so highway riding gets old quick and the seat isn't particularly comfortable, which you'll notice on any ride that goes past an hour. Storage options are limited unless you start bolting on accessories that kind of ruin the clean styling you bought the bike for in the first place. It's not bad at what it does, it's just that what it does is pretty narrow, and most people don't realize that until they own it and start making excuses for why they're keeping it. By 2026, the regret comes from understanding you bought a second bike that you're trying to use as a first bike, and it's not working, but you're in too deep to admit you chose style over everything else that actually matters for daily riding, and now you're stuck with a bike that looks great but doesn't fit your life. Number 8. Yamaha MT10. The crossplane inline 4 sounds incredible and makes this bike feel like a total weapon for about 30 miles, and then you're at a gas station again wondering if maybe you should have bought something that doesn't drink fuel, like it's got a problem. 998cc, making great power and all the right noises, but the fuel consumption is atrocious, and the real-world range means you're stopping for gas more often than you're stopping for fun. The bike encourages aggressive riding constantly, which is exciting until you realize that excitement costs you in fuel economy, and your wallet starts asking questions. Upright ergonomics sound good, but the riding experience is intense enough that longer rides get fatiguing, and between the fuel stops and the constant high-energy delivery, you end up adapting your riding around the bike's demands instead of the bike fitting into your life. The seat is pretty terrible for anything over an hour, and wind protection is minimal. So highway cruising turns into a workout you didn't sign up for. People bought these expecting a hooligan machine they could ride every day, and they got the hooligan part, but the everyday part is harder than expected. The engine character is genuinely special, but by 2026, that character doesn't make up for the fact that you're planning rides based on gas station locations and getting tired from a bike that never lets you just chill. Heat management isn't great either, especially in traffic where the bike gets uncomfortable fast. The regret isn't that it's bad, it's that it's exhausting and expensive to feed, and you're realizing too late that you wanted fun, not a part-time job managing fuel stops and fatigue. At number 9. Honda Africa Twin CRF 1100. You bought into the adventure lifestyle, except your actual lifestyle is mostly pavement and maybe a gravel road twice a year if you're feeling adventurous. 1084cc parallel twin, long travel suspension. Tall seat height and enough weight that low-speed maneuvering feels like a workout you didn't sign up for. The bike is genuinely capable off-road, but most owners discover their idea of adventure is riding to national parks, on paved highways, and occasionally looking at dirt roads they're not actually going to ride down. DCT models add another layer of electronic complexity that's convenient until it's not, and then you're dealing with dealer diagnostics for a transmission that regular bikes just don't need. The size makes it intimidating for a lot of riders. The electronics require setup and understanding that not everyone wants to invest time in, and the whole package ends up being overkill for what people actually do on it. Wind protection is decent, but the tall windscreen creates turbulence that gets annoying on longer highway rides. And the seat height means a lot of riders can't flat-foot it at stops, which kills confidence in traffic. Fuel economy is good, but the range advantage doesn't matter much when you're mostly commuting and running errands. By 2026, the regret sets in when you're stuck managing this big, heavy adventure bike in parking lots and commuting and realizing that the capability you paid for is capability you're never using. You bought the dream of adventure riding and got the reality of riding a tall, heavy bike to Starbucks, and occasionally feeling guilty that you're not doing what the bike was designed for, while also knowing you probably never will. And down to the last, but not the least, Harley-Davidson Sportster S. The Sportster name carries decades of history as Harley's entry-level bike, and people bought this expecting that heritage wrapped in modern updates, except Harley completely redefined what Sportster means. And a lot of buyers weren't ready for that. 1252cc Revolution Max V-twin making serious power, aggressive ergonomics and suspension that's firm enough to qualify as punishment on anything other than smooth pavement. The riding position is committed and sporty, which sounds cool until you're an hour into a ride and your back is asking what you were thinking. Suspension travel is limited, and the damping is stiff, which means bumps go straight through the chassis and into you, and after a while that gets old fast. People came in expecting a versatile Harley they could cruise on and got a performance-focused machine that's pretty narrow in what it does well. The seat is basically a suggestion, and comfort on longer rides is not a priority the engineers seem to consider. It's powerful and handles well for a cruiser, but the compromises are significant, and the bike doesn't fit traditional Harley use cases, which is confusing when it's wearing a badge that means something specific to people. By 2026, the regret comes from realizing you bought a Sportster that isn't really a Sportster, and now you're stuck with a bike that's too aggressive for cruising and too uncomfortable for distance, and you're trying to convince yourself you like it, when really you're just disappointed it's not what the name led you to expect. Look, the pattern here is pretty obvious. These bikes are impressive on paper and disappointing in practice. They're either too complex and need dealer babysitting, too hot and uncomfortable for normal riding, too heavy for what you actually do, or they're solving problems you don't have while creating new ones you didn't expect. The bikes aren't necessarily bad, they're just mismatched with how people actually ride and what they can realistically handle long-term. Showroom appeal and magazine reviews don't prepare you for the reality of living with something every day, and that gap between expectation and experience is where regret lives. Some of you are still gonna buy these bikes anyway because they look good, or because your buddy swears his is fine, or because you're convinced you're different. That's cool. People ignore advice all the time. Just remember that "it's just not for me" sounds better than "I made a mistake" when you're writing that Craigslist ad in 6 months. If you own one of these and you're still happy with it, great, you beat the odds. For everyone else, maybe test ride it longer than 20 minutes before you sign. If you enjoyed this, or it helped in some ways, follow us, 'cause we got more coming. See you in the next video.